Hello everybody, today I'd like to read to you a chapter of A Little History of Economics by Niall Kishtainy. Chapter 9, Too Many Maths. In Charles Dickens' story, A Christmas Carol, we meet that most bad-tempered of Mrs. Ebenezer Scrooge. On Christmas Eve, he's sitting in his office counting his money, and grumbling at his clerk who wants to stay home with his family on Christmas Day. Two gentlemen come in to ask for a donation of a few pennies to buy meat and drink for the poor. Scrooge scowls at them and shoos them out of the room. Speaking about the poor, he says to the departing visitors, if they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Earlier we met a financial genius and one of the great British economists, David Ricardo, and his good friend, the clergyman Thomas Malthus. Malthus wasn't as good as Malthus, 1766 to 1833, wasn't as good as earning money as Ricardo, but turned out to be very good at coming up with economic theories that made people sit up and take notice. He was the first ever professor of economics, appointed in 1805 to the East India College, which trained officers from the East India Company, which trained officers of the East India, the famous British trading company. Some thinkers' ideas don't become widely known while they're alive. Malthus's certainly did. Shortly before Dickens wrote his tale, Malthus achieved fame for an economic doctrine that made people think of him as the Scrooge of economics, the peddler of a truly mean and stingy theory. Malthus feared that an ever-growing population, more people meant more poverty, he claimed. All that a growing population would do was to condemn more and more people to a wretched existence. And there was no point in trying to help the poor. That would only make the situation worse. Earlier economic thinkers hadn't shared Malthus's pessimism about the big populations. The mercantilists were in favor of them. They believed that the large populations helped nations to win out over foreign rivals, because a large labor force working for low wages allowed manufacturers to make cheap goods to sell abroad, and a large army and navy made possible the defense of the nation's trade routes. After the mercantilists, the utopian thinkers Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, and Henry de Saint-Simon said that people weren't doomed to poverty. They believed above all in progress. If people helped each other, poverty and squalor could be abolished, they said. Malthus's father, Daniel, admired the utopians, believing their ideas to be the keys to a better society. Malthus strongly disagreed, and father and son spent hours arguing it out. Eventually, Malthus set down his ideas in a pamphlet he published in 1798, which made his reputation. In its title, he named some of the British and French prophets of progress with whom he disagreed. It was called An Essay on the Principle of Population, as it affects the future improvement of society, with remarks on the speculations of Mr. Godwin, M. Condorcet, and other writers. The last named, the Marquis de Condorcet, was a leader of the French Revolution of 1789. in which the people rose up and overthrew their king in the hope of creating a better society, one in which ordinary folk had the power. The revolution was a blazing comet, but it would lead to humanity's victory over poverty. But would it lead to humanity's victory over poverty? Condorcet said it would. Humanity was on a march towards perfection. Civilization had already progressed through 9 stages of improvement, and the 10th stage, equality between all people and nations, was just round the corner. Malthus poured cold water on all of this. He takes some harmless-sounding starting points. First, humans need food to survive. Second, they must have sex in order to reproduce. What's more, they like having sex and will keep doing it. In a couple of decades, today's child will produce a couple of children, who in turn will have a couple of children, and so on. The population expands by big amounts as time goes on. Malthus says that if left unchecked, the population tends to double each generation. So after 2 generations, a population of 1,000 will have grown to 4,000, after 6 generations to 64,000. But what about the food needed to feed the extra people? You can certainly increase food production a bit, but not by anything like as fast as the doubling population. For one thing, you can't double the area of the land. Malthus said that food production grows by a fixed amount each generation at a much slower rate than population. Population will quickly outstrip food supply. There'll soon be too many mouths gobbling up too little food. So what happens? People brakes on population act to bring the number of people back into line with the supply of food. First, famine and disease kill people off. Second, people have fewer children. The problem is that they have fewer children by committing sins. The worst would be the murder of a newborn. But people also reduce the number of children by carrying out abortions and using contraception, both of which were widely misjudged as sinful in those days. The result, then, is misery and vice, more deaths as a result of illness and hunger, fewer births as a result of human beings' sins. Suppose that the country gained a new source of wealth, perhaps land captured during a war, which allowed it to feed more people. At first, there'd be more food to go around. Being richer, people would have more children, and being healthier, fewer people would die. As the population grew, there'd be more mouths gobbling up the food supply with less available for each. Eventually, society would end up where it started. The people would have simply bred themselves back to the lower standard of living that they'd have before the new land was discovered. The belief that people tend to get stuck at a subsistence standard of living, just enough to survive, was shared by other 19th century economists such as David Ricardo. It implied that workers' wages only ever cover that subsistence and came to be known as the Iron Law of Wages. With his ratios of food and population, Malthus showed the grim logic of the law. Malthus's arithmetic had another gloomy implication. For centuries, local areas in Britain had supported the poor and the sick. In Malthus's time, the poor were given payments to help them to buy food. Malthus criticized this. The payments were simply rewarded them laziness. If people weren't helped, they were more likely to help themselves. According to his population principle, help to the poor is like finding new land. It boosts population, but then produces more misery and sin to bring population back into line with food production. Charity doesn't help the poor or society at large, but simply creates greater numbers of immoral miserable beggars. Marriage and sex are some of life's great joys, but they'll eventually lead to wretchedness. So much for the human progress held so dear by the utopians. There was a ray of hope, though. Men and women could choose to restrain the sex drive and so reduce their contribution to the burden of a higher population. Malthus encouraged people to delay getting married, following his own advice by waiting until his late 30s to do so. For some, though, it might mean never marrying. Unsurprisingly, Malthus's writings were provoked howls of disapproval. He was attacked for being a grumpy killjoy, or worse, a cold-hearted man who condemns the poor on the earth. Karl Marx branded Malthus's ideas a libel on the human race. The Victorian philosopher and historian Thomas Carlyle called them mournful and dreary, and he gave economics a nickname, the dismal science. Later, history disproved many of Malthus's ideas. The population started to grow fast, but the brakes on it from days of famine receded. In the 19th century, better medicine and cleaner cities helped people to live longer. They stopped getting wiped out by famines and disease. Malthus said that when people get richer, they have more children. But the opposite happened over the 19th and 20th centuries, when in many countries population growth slowed down. More reliable contraceptives were invented and became easier to get hold of, and most people stopped believing that it was wrong to use them. Even Malthus's miserable mass of poor people started to have fewer children because new kinds of work in factories and offices offered better earnings than digging fields. With fewer children to feed, they could spend more on schooling them so that they could do the new jobs. Over the 19th century, something else happened which neither Malthus or the prophets of progress saw. New technology raised living standards so that people could permanently earn more than in the bare minimum needed to survive. Britain was one of the first countries to increase the productivity of its farms so that more mouths could be fed. Later on, once the effects of steam, iron, and railways came together in the Industrial Revolution, other necessities of life were produced more cheaply and for a greater number of people. If you drew graphs of population and average income in Europe from the start of our story to the present, you'd see the two lines bob up and down slightly for centuries, but stay more or less flat most of the time. After the 18th century, the line zoomed upwards and keep on going. There were many more people and they had even higher incomes. Think of what people in Britain had in the middle of the 20th century. Plentiful food, clothes, perhaps a car, compared with 1700, where they had to eat scraps and trudge through mud for hours to get anywhere. And by the mid-20th century, there were 6 times as many of them. For the first time, the economies of Europe and America supported big cities and constantly expanding population. It was one of the most extraordinary transformations in human history, certainly the most remarkable economic one. After humankind's long battle against hardship, material progress had accelerated dramatically. Before the takeoff, however, economies were quite like how Malthus had described them. Income never grew that much. Peasant farmers often struggled to survive. Sometimes relatives or the church helped out when times were hard, but a bad harvest or an outbreak of disease could mean starvation and death. Many mothers die during childbirth, and many children never survive their infancy. If Matthes's ideas were more full and dismal, then so were the conditions in which people had to live. Malthus was spelling out with grim clarity the constraints facing people living in those early societies. In our own time, this is still the fate of many of the world's poorest countries. Today, when people talk about a population explosion, they're usually borrowing Malthus's ideas. Many believe that there are just too many people and that the world is getting uncomfortably crowded. However, in parts of his writings that often get forgotten, Malthus said that he wasn't anti-population at all, and he thought that having many people was a good thing as long as society had the means to feed them. Perhaps he wasn't such a Scrooge after all. His friends remembered him as a kind and friendly man, not at all mean and miserly. Many economists who today study the growth of economies over the long term think that large populations go with healthy economies. People use up resources, but they also create new ones. More people mean more brains, and so more new ideas about how to produce society as well. That's all for today. Bye-bye.